Hello everyone, today we talk about the expansion of medieval thought between the 11th and the 13th century, just like we did some days ago, but in a bit of a broader perspective and connecting it to certain movements. In this time, of course, there were many, but I think it's interesting to focus on the spiritual mover, let's say, of certain even literary models that did not directly constitute the translation of those thought or political, contestation, etc. In literature, but that definitely are part of this broader, capacity of coming back to look at even with a renewed faith in God as much as in mankind, right? That is typical of the period, right? After an early Middle Ages in which the literary, the intellectual advancements were mostly based on an authoritative base, and there was also a slightly or less optimistic view of mankind, and also greater fear towards the wrath of God rather than a kind of a humanizing ideal like the ones that flourished here in this century. So we also made a video about the theorization of architectural aesthetics in ecclesiastical architecture, actually by Bernard of Clairvaux. Today we will partly address, but that's also a quite tightly connected video. The reevaluation of the female figure, right? The centrality of Mary, of the Virgin in the Christian art and thought overall. And it may seem, say, provoking at least, that such new ideas in necessity also, to develop them in function of a protest, of a criticism, right? Always maintaining that these times were always, within the Christian thinking, right? We shouldn't indulge into kind of modernizing, secularized thinking when addressing, for example, the great so-called radical movements or the broader pauperistic-evangelic push of these times, as if there was someone who was claiming like a free thinking in a modern sense, right? That these people were actually fully within a Christian mindset that they could not evade from because it was not convenient to do in the first place at the time. They were just, however, debating quite hotly and contesting, as you know, chiefly the ecclesiastical hierarchies and how these function, especially after the structuration of the so-called papal monarchy, with the reforming papacy that took place exactly in the centuries, and structuring a power and also kind of effective, not just spiritual, but also secular power all over Europe, which naturally these societies began to feel the, I don't think, if you've made many videos actually on medieval Christianity, I don't think there was an incoherent picture in how the clergy got structured at this point. As much as, there is nothing strange, it was contestation of this. As these are just expressions of orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and they can be found in every single social context, historically speaking, aside from even from religion in itself, but simply, in the attitude that people develop towards this, which are fundamentally political and social issues, as the church at the time naturally was the world, right? These people were part of the clergy, and they rightfully, of the church, and they rightfully felt that they had a part in, determining how the clergy also was to be structured, and the church overall, also in a kind of material sense. We have seen the increasing contrast between this huge amount of wealth for those time standards, and for the first time many areas of Europe actually starts flowing, right, unpreceded, in terms of just of ratio, let's say, of speed of acquisition, but also of actual sheer quantity, right, over time. Therefore, also there were these tensions in a world that was generally aimed since the previous centuries towards this, idealization of poverty, of sacrifice, of humility, etc. That evidently brought people to kind of feel unease with this new acquired wealth, but at the same time not being able to really come out of this society, for which naturally even the evangelistic-pauperistic movement produced some forms of hermetism, of detachment of the world, but also actually through political and social upheavals and protests, also pretty violent ones in many cases. And much more than even just this phenomena triggered by the poverty of the masses, and also the increasing in authority and central power of the secular elites, right? They were generally actually allied with the ecclesiastical ones overall, right? In spite of the clash for investitures and all, the state, let's call it in this way, and the church were fundamentally together, right? Still distinct, right? Okay, let's not digress excessively, but let's also remember that, thinking that state and church were quite not separated it's not entirely correct, right? It was not, it was true, obviously, in the Christian world as per se, right? But naturally, the church is spiritual, is meant at least to be spiritual. The state is meant to be secular, right? So these are two different worlds, two different grounds. And the meeting one is the meeting part is just the human experience overall. And naturally, this human experience produced politics, war, social dynamics, etc. But yet the concept here of the separation, at least on two different levels, maybe overlapping but still separated essentially between state and church, is present, and also the Middle Ages owes much to the eventual institutional and juridical separation of state and church that we mostly attribute to the 17th century in Europe, in the Western world overall. But this is really another topic. But what I would like to focus on today is, in fact, the intellectual stimulations that came from the multiplication of religious messages by work of itinerant preachers, hermits, monks, canons, clergy, men of all sorts, and also the increasing presence at all levels of the ecclesiastical organizations of fundamentally people of secular people, of laymen, and also of people who were fundamentally leading now a bit between the clergy and the lay world, right? And this also ambiguity that sometimes existed eventually brought to the creation, the formalization of the mendicant orders, and the possibility also many lay people, men and women, by the way, that felt the necessity of having a deeper spiritual existence, but also not being part of the clergy as such, that could join and participate. So new thinking, new new really circulation of people, right? We shouldn't think that even in the early Middle Ages monasteries, for not talking obviously about the bishoprics, but we're not interacting with the laymen, right? The people came to work, came to produce, all the illuminations. These are the centuries in which there is a lot of handcraft work that starts coming for the clergy from the lay world, and this naturally means that the clergy becomes ever more mundane, right? And this is not just an outwards, an inwards phenomenon. It's also an outwards one. As the preaching, for example, it was aimed at the propaganda of the ideals of ecclesiastical reforms, or the Crusades, right, were vehicles of transmission and of radiation, let's say, of emanation. I don't know to say that, but outside of the clergy proper, of also among the laymen, of a more aware religious form of spirituality, we can say. That is to say, a world that is naturally much more interconnected than before, also socially speaking, and for which people are starting to feel that they can somewhat have a say also in what the world should be about. Think about what the reforming papacy had been, what all the tensions that brought from the secular world to create a reform of the clergy. This happened at the highest levels of the secular authorities. It was the reforming papacy actually was recollecting a political program that had been created actually by the Ottonians, by the same emperor. So the clash for investors actually owed much, and excessively much, for the secular authorities to themselves, right? As naturally this would backfire, the church would grow ever more powerful and demanding more to them. But it was not just an inner matter of the church. There were also many different paths that things could have taken, individual figures without which we would have not even had the reform of the church, at least as we know it, right? And not necessarily in that moment, another. People were generally speaking better off at this point. They were wealthier per capita. They could read more often. So, for example, the Gospels were more freely interpreted now. This was a problem of the time in the sense that during early medieval Europe, objectively, Europe never had, Christianity never had a competitor on the horizon that could, become an intellectual threat to the Christian teaching, right? Paganism didn't absolutely have the intellectual tools to do that. Essentially the clergy didn't even care much, right? They, of course, cared to gradually frame these local communities in a more, aware and firm and formally sanctioned Christian dimension, but also, if peasants kept believing, pagan stuff next to the Christian one, which is typical of paganism, because, paganism integrates literally everything, including monotheism, the clergy didn't care. The problem now started coming when people began to, more organized and robust societies, and even entire polities began to, to lean towards certain heterodox thinking from within the same Christian teaching, right? This is very important if you look at the history of the Albigensian Crusade, and of course we read that mostly through the Roman and French filter, right? Because that is what there are also local Occitan sources, etc. But the idea there is naturally that the Cathars were somewhat an invention of Orthodoxy, in the sense that the southern French, the Occitan, weren't really heretics as we think, but there was not even a proper church in this regard, or at least not a formalized one that was coupled, married with the institutions. But definitely there was a tendency of parts of Europe, like Occitan as a region with a common historical cultural background, could attempt to drive away from the centralistic push of the papacy, and in that case also the pressure of the French monarchy that was tightening its grip on these southern vassals that, however, remained also always nominally practically independent, right? There would be a lot to add in this sense, but it's obvious that now the Gospels, think about the coercive means of those times. Who would control now that heterodox thinking, with not heresies, could spread? Right, it was a big deal. There weren't means at the time. The walls, political and institutional structures had very slowly and very, with a great effort in Western Europe, developed a satisfactory level, and still everything was based largely on a constant political negotiation and dialectic. But how could you control people's thought in the 12th century? It's a huge deal, right? Important, naturally, is that the people that count are within Orthodoxy, so that their clienteles and their subjects can remain within the frame anyway, because where are they going anyway? These are the centuries also of the great systemic imbalances. So lots of people were, reading the Gospels also, and in their more radical way, in the imitation to the apostolic models, as an essential reference, also naturally to criticize, for example, the wealth of the church, right? Literary interpretation of passages. As we were saying before, don't think that this was like freedom of thought in the way we do. Actually, this was also sometimes a fundamentalistic approach to the teachings, and it was naturally all bent to the political aims these people wanted. So it's obvious that from disinherited from an outcast, the let's say, not the distrust, but I mean the idea that the hierarchies, that the state is something else, right, compared to the kingdom of heaven, would make them inherently believe that whatever was happening in terms of hierarchy and authority in this world was wrong and had to be taken down, right? Look at these days. Not much has changed, because guess what? There are certain fringes of society that always do this. And they're even useful in a way, in the sense that if there weren't those, it would be just a too kind of sclerotic and crystallized, large, overwhelming orthodoxy that wouldn't move, and it would cause an immobilism that is dangerous for a society. But still, this created a lot of attrition, and much more than that, in a moment in which even the rise actually of the what would become the so-called national monarchies and this feudal kingdoms fundamentally doesn't have to be seen as just the evil, rich, powerful guy want to subject everybody. There is the point that many people actually needed an authority in a world where more leaders, think about the Brahman song, etc., could cross and destroy your land, your farms, kill your family, and all this stuff. You prefer a king that also is coupled in this sense with ecclesiastical hierarchies, that is given an order that is going to pacify on a large scale, rather than saying, okay, let's destroy all authority because we don't need it. That's not really what you need. But it's also true, of course, that many of these people came exactly from those systemic imbalances, is seen as a failure of the authority. And more in general, the Christians saw the history at the time, maybe slightly less, but still fundamentally, as a constant process of decay, right? Things would go at their worst before the second come of Christ, and the Antichrist would have been there before, right? So the whole idea that is the world was descending, that and this naturally required a greater need, just for the anxiety that this whole situation is produced, to live in a more righteous way. If the world is going to end soon, it's better for me to maybe take literally the Bible, this kind of magic book, because don't think that people at the time even had an actual theological culture or education. What do you think that the pauperistic-evangelic movements were, right? When the church came to the point of institutionalizing some of them, framing them within the church, it took a lot before giving them an actual actual Christian education on the base of the scriptures. And think about it. Yeah, I mean, this is debatable at levels that naturally entail, in fact, how do you interpret the Bible, and what do you think you have to respond to? And this was a huge deal that wasn't still not solved even today. Right? Think about the Protestant Reform in general, how this problem came back once again. Over and over again, even during the same Middle Ages, after all, the same crystallization and the victory of Orthodoxy in most of Europe, right? But at the end of the Middle Ages, Europe was being broken in half. and even before Luther, because as a matter of fact, certain countries also had other reasons rather than other just religious to say, okay, let's have a church on our own, right? But I guess you know what I'm talking about. So the objective of first of all, not just clergymen now read the gospel, of course, also laymen that used these interpretation to affirm their right to live in a relation with the divine, naturally in a more direct, immediate way, and in a process, in fact, criticizing the incoherence of the ecclesiastical hierarchies with the Christian message in their reading of the scriptures. So the aware religious experience is one of those paths of entrance for the layman to culture, right? This is a big deal because the so-called illiterati, right, those that were illiterates, right, that couldn't read, that would just, that were bringing actually a culture on their own, that even if it wasn't written at this point, I mean, think about the 11th century, how many people still essentially, pass down important knowledge orally, all the traditions that stemmed from the pagan past. There was a world that we can't reconstruct. It was extremely rich. And that at this point, I mean, like, we can barely reconstruct the list, is in fact starting to pour in, even within literature. And because now these people could access writing, it was still rare, of course, but it was substantial enough to be systematic, structural, all over at least Western Europe, and bringing in new views of the world that, in this regard, probably were influencing the same attitudes towards the Christian thinking, right? This is very important because we don't have to think at this point Europe was, now fully Christianized and nothing else, right? There were all these various consciences and cultures and different views and understandings of religion of the world that naturally were all but homogeneous in Europe, right? It's obvious that the lands of more ancient Christianization were also particularly, that were more urbanized, more literate. They saw Christianity as kind of a imposant theological, philosophical point of reference. Others at the fringes of Europe were still living within, their own, older consciousness, now just touched sometimes, and by the Christian teachings, and still seeing reality sometimes in different ways. This difference between peoples in Europe is very fascinating. We actually never touched it because on Schwerpunkt we generally try to think there was actually more a unifying element in medieval Europe overall than this local diversities. But we can't pretend, of course, that this awareness was present, at the level of the average European, right? It was the elites that at this point really were a truly European elite, where at this point, wherever Frankish culture spread, in terms of naturally a product of many other things, not just because it stemmed from France, but also because carrying within its political, institutional culture a lot of legacies, including the Roman and Christian one, but naturally also others, were truly European. Here, think about even a common script, a common way of think about all the monastic orders. They were trans-European in this regard. There was a truly and very strong and very well-structured and Balkan and well-centered European culture at that time. But the masses of the, were still feeling somewhat the depression that was coming from this same systematization of the world that, as we were saying before, it was normal to try to escape in a way, right? This is also the centuries, for example, of the affirmation of chivalry. Now, feudalism was actually a pretty brutal thing, There was an actual contempt of the elites towards the peasantry. We've said it many times. There were astonishing violences in oppression and crimes and impunity. Even think about the clergy, the ecclesiastical privileges of lands like, lands of the empire, or in Rome, that where the clergy literally did whatever the heck they liked. These are realities that they lasted in Europe in certain cases up to even the 19th century, the 20th century, even in certain areas, especially in the East. But there was definitely we're talking about primitive times for our own standards in terms of of course, human rights, etc. There was here it's paradoxical that it's this same culture that already had actually, but was developing further, and very importantly, the Middle Ages, the embryo of what the same rights and visions and moral values are today, right? And this is very thought-provoking because it really makes you understand how civilization is not either good or bad, right? These are the new narratives that are coming out because of deeply dividing ideas of politics that, however, are very brutal. They're very primitive themselves. They're very weak and superficial, intellectually speaking, and that's where they're destined to disappear, always to remain always at the fringe of imagination. But what really makes a civilization, what really brings forward, right, it also passes through an enormous sacrifice and through an enormous push that can naturally be driven also by negative reactions, right? The idea that feudalism affirmed itself because of a need of a constant insecurity, actually, that brought the necessity of this kind of politically, militarily hierarchized culture that had to hold the reins of populations that otherwise would have been subjected to anarchy, to chaos, to continuous infighting, and also being exposed to external threats. So feudal Europe, in this sense, brought it was a dramatic improvement overall, right? We should talk a bit more. We made a lot of videos actually in the Notice Out on playlists, in which we addressed this thing. I mean, the resilience of medieval civilization and the fact that this world actually had pretty damn good basis. It didn't vanish with a pandemics like it had happened in the late antiquity. It actually brought forward, it created Renaissance, it created what we call modern Europe. Modern Europe is not an accomplishment of modern Europe. Modern Europe is an accomplishment of medieval Europe. And as much as contemporary Western world is definitely an accomplishment of lots of people who came before us, it's an accomplishment of the modern Europe, of medieval Europe, of ancient Europe, and also in the other cultures of Asia and North Africa. We'll see now that we're actually bringing on a lot of knowledge, a lot of manuscripts, a lot of ideas that helped even this world to refine itself. So, and yet, behind this strong face, it was still if you want, the popular, the vernacular, even the profane, in many ways, that cannot be eliminated. It's always there, and it's always meant to, give this touch of vitality and of spontaneity and of maybe really freedom of thought as we think it to be, right? The freedom of thought doesn't express itself in a radical ideology, right? Revolutionaries throughout all history have been driven by some of the most vicious and violent and exclusivistic and elitistic and discriminatory ideologies ever conceivable. But the spontaneity of ignorance, the spontaneity of the popular tradition of folklore, right? This is eventually raped and destroyed by knowledge, actually, and it's instead this apparently free and and pure world, that I think some of us still today, even in our highly modern and secularized worlds, we can't see, even if we have, for example, older relatives that live in the country that have always been there. You can understand the generosity, the genuinity, the hospitality. I mean, all values that in our frenetic world we have lost because we have kind of rationalized the whole thing. And yes, we have accomplished something actually, but we have also lost something that makes our heart beat in a way that we rarely tune with anymore at all. Right, it's as if we were damned by this eternal chaos that we are created, because we are attracted by chaos to make sense, to make order of it. And for this very reason, however, the process, let's say, of transfer of different cultural perspectives, let's put it in this way, or traditions, in literature. Is not uniform, it's not univocal, right? In time and space, in medieval Europe, it had a lot to do with too many processes that have to do with language, in general with society, of course, even with the single social contexts. Think about the difference, for example, just in literacy. And in Britain culture between Southern and Northern Europe, and how this, for example, translated itself in the forms of linguistical expression. Like in the North, the vernacular became much more quickly a written language than it became in the South, where Latin was still maintaining its first place, even though people spoke actually a different language. That was even more articulated and enriched than the one. But so there are lots of philological points that we also made some videos about. But there is one thing in common that we could highlight in this regard, that is the revelation, if you want, for us, historically speaking, because we basically can't see it anyway, right, of a profane culture. Right, what the hell do we know what actually profane culture was before these times, historically speaking? Do you think that, I don't know, we know what common people thought or reasoned or spoke in ancient Rome? Well, we have some hints scattered here and there, but we have literally no idea, and that is Rome. Think about, the rest of Europe, even in areas where not encompassed by the Roman Empire. We have to wait the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, actually, for these people to even start to write something consistent, so that to understand to hear their voice sometimes. Think in this way. Think about the Minas Anger, all the sagas, the Germanic epic, that were something that was created centuries and centuries before, but that was put and written down only at this point. And otherwise, we don't know anything about before, what was happening before. And this is an incredibly important time, exactly for this reason, because we can finally see the imposition of the vernacular languages and of their literary expressions. Also, we should point out that not all the lay and the properly lay phenomena are always antagonistic towards the hegemonic clerical cultural tradition of the time, right? This is also a bad pattern of interpretation. As we said at the very beginning of the video, actually, clergymen and laymen worked shoulder to shoulder, and actually much even of the what they interpret as some of the greatest lay or secular accomplishments in, I don't know, think about the great feudal kingdoms or the great communes in Italy. These actually originated fundamentally from a clerical tradition, right? They all emerged essentially from the episcopal elite, and that had been during early medieval times naturally the repository of this more complex administrative and practices and knowledge in fact of Roman and Christian tradition proper. So we can point out naturally the certain literary genres like the chansons de geste, the romances, the lais, the fabuleux, right? These are kind of the most famous, the composers of which were actually clergymen themselves, right? And this is also very important, like in thinking how the progress occurred, especially in areas where literacy was fundamentally a monopoly of the clergy, such that, of course, the clergy was the first one to get, to put down in written form all these, let's say, this incredible set of folklore, of traditions, of ideas that were part of the lay world properly meant, right? There was definitely an influence, of course, of the scholastic education that they had gotten through for becoming literates themselves, right? So this is not strange, and this naturally has filtered in a particular way the elements in which this new intellectual creations, that these novelties were articulated, right? And this also tended to happen in an area that was particular in Europe. For this reason, there was France, right? France was not actually the most literate place in Europe, right? The criterion here is not exactly, where people wrote the earliest the most. They began to put down in popular stuff on pergamon, right? Or on paper, actually, at the end of this period. First, right? Actually, as we were saying before, some regions of southern Europe were much more strict in this sense, because the same laymen were, even more educated enough than the average to still say, okay, what do I write this stuff down for if I'm, a notary, or I have a prestigious place in this office? That's what their lives would be about. This thing happens in kind of a middle ground, right? And essentially in a context of entertainment, sometimes even of divertissement, and that is in fact the one of the courts of northern and southern France, right? These are seigneurial courts fundamentally, and this is the area where we see more accentuated this tendency of this sensitivity from the side of the same nobility to the refinement in lifestyle, for example, and the intellectual divertissement that requires new literary and coherent works, right? And also a new, let's say, relatively new culture that, in this sense, is able to modify, actually to manipulate extraordinarily the classical and Christian tradition alike, but not only, because these people were aware, for example, of the profane culture coming from Mozarabic and Muslim Spain. They also knew the Celtic symbols and imaginary, right? France, in this regard, is also, a pretty important land because of the context with a wide variety of different, cultures, right? They were close to the Celtic fringe with Brittany, and also, the British Isles are just across the sea. Spain was definitely the most important area of influence, probably, since the major flow of Hellenic and Islamic works coming from the east was passing actually still yet not through Italy but through Spain, right? In the same Muslim Spain, some of the greatest centers of translation were like Toledo, for example, had been populated by Christians since a lot of times, right? The Italians, for example, went across southern France to Spain, right? And getting Italian literature had a dramatic boost given by this French and Spanish influence, especially in the 12th century, but also in the 13th. Also, the German area in the east, as we will see, actually Germany and Italy are the countries that will get the most from this French area in terms of literary traditions, albeit in different ways. And also there is to consider that these are different societies. Like France is largely, as we see here, a feudal world. It's a courtly world. There is a much more hierarchized and stratified society. Italy is actually said some of the freest, less, where the wealth is more, largely distributed, with a higher per capita wealth and a great political fragmentation, a kind of, can say, republican governments of the city-states. Germany is at this point still 12th century in the wild, right? In here even. The new architectural form took a lot of time before pouring into this forested and swampy world that took a great immense work now to expand further, to structure, and to adopt even things like French feudalism would be arrived in Germany proper during the reign of Frederick Barbarossa, right? Because before there was just a somewhat loose vassalic beneficiary system in which all these various duchies that composed Germany, or better still, Eastern Francia, were made of. So this culture naturally declines itself in a different way, and it also finds different models, right? As we were saying before, for example, the Italians were definitely the ones who wrote the most in absolute terms at this point, but yet they didn't write what the French wrote. In these, at least in these literary terms, they produced a much greater deal of administration, of accounting, but in different fields in of written tradition, right? But Spain is this area from which there is this enormous wave that pours right in, and it had always been so, especially in this area of southern France, of this broader world that had been the Visigothic one. Ideally, it was still felt like that. If you visit those areas, you can feel the air of Spain in a way, right? In this, even in the architecture and tradition, think about all these great characters that were born in southern France, in Auvergne, in Aquitaine, etc. That were automatically intellectually drawn in from the Spanish world, from the Mozarabic and Islamic world that wrote, that knew, that formed these people in a omnicomprehensive way, because what was coming from the East was largely already reflecting in a more universalistic and rationalistic, especially with Aristotle. Western Europe had gone on fundamentally with Augustine, hence Neoplatonism essentially, and didn't know this kind of rationalistic systematization, but that eventually came in with Aristotle and scholastics, etc. But just think about the opening of the mind in this specific geographic area, right? And it's very fascinating that this new literature was pioneered by the nobility. It was the nobility that composed songs, that wrote with courtly love, all this thing. It was a shared, even a sort of class language, right? It was a common education, common interest, common curiosity towards this world. And naturally, it has its own limits as well, because it's a hypocrite world. Of course, these were people who were, preaching, angelic love, courtly love. This. If you look at the costumes of this nobility, like actually the rest of the world, but they were brutally diverging in this sense. And a way for which a reason for which this literature was created was also in fact for moral purposes, to discipline individuals to look otherwise. There's all in courtly love, for example, a pretty pragmatic view of marriage policy, and in this sense of economic assets, etc. To discipline these knights, this nobility. There was a ferocious competition regarding these things specifically, and it was, however, a world that was experimenting also a crisis within itself, right? Why all this spread of Catholicism in southern France, where the problem started from there? Well, because also in here it was felt, given the enrichment of southern France in these areas, kind of spread sense of of guilt for being for looking at the moral and material poverty that naturally populated the world at the time, in getting all this wealth at once. Especially these were nobles, so that many threw away their goods, especially women. We know the result. They abandoned the second that they went into monasteries. They kind of repented in this ascetic way that was actually very close to those heresies of Bogomilism, like of Catholicism, deriving from of course from the Gnosticism, right? From Gnosticism, that were stressing these the contrast between the matter and the spirit, so that everything that concerns the matter, including the body, has to be fundamentally mortified. And there was this even psychotic, when not schizophrenic, attitude. We know actually of certain behaviors that were described in a way that really make you significantly doubt of the mental health of people. I mean, think about people who whip themselves, who in this sense made the most atrocious physical damages and wound just for coming close to Christ's experience. Well, I don't think that that's something that is really written in the Bible, but that's the point. That's the point, that people were essentially trying to experience something without losing the plot, essentially, what was even the healthy reading of the scriptures was, and other factors were coming in, also dictated by, in fact, not strictly religious reasons, spiritual, but also influenced by all these new thinkings and worldviews that were becoming a problem for orthodoxy to stem, right? The same Aristotle, actually, that came part to be of naturally the cosmological view of the church with scholastic, was actually at the beginning forbidden, and it came straight from Spain to Paris, where it was taught everywhere. That's where some of the greatest heresies spread at that point. We made several videos about these things, and that's what brought in the end the Roman Church to say, okay, you know what, we can't stop Aristotle from spreading, because there was no me. Right, the same professors of theology were reading and teaching that, right, and their pupils would do anyway. So they managed, and this is one of the greatest accomplishment of medieval civilization and of Christianity in general, to adopt this Western Christianity, at least to adopt this new systems of reference, and to adapt it to the, in fact, rationalizing and kind of scientifically oriented mentality that was spreading in Europe at this point. Because consider that Europe now, Western Europe was rocketing in terms of sheer technical, literary, and scientific development. Like the 12th century is the latest century in which basically Western Europe kind of lagged behind from an intellectual, technical, if this had ever been a thing actually, point of view, from compared to the Arab and Byzantine world. But the 12th century, Western Europeans take over. There is nothing to do with that. The other models crumble. They're actually massively influenced by the Western models in everything, and you can't see that the myth that we came out of the Middle Ages because some humanist read an Hellenic manuscript in the 15th century out of the blue and everything changes. It's pure historical fantasy, right? The 12th century was a century of dramatic development that really set the basis largely even for what we call modern Europe proper. So the French intellectual production, of course, the North was a bit different in this. The North, we concentrated on the South, but if you look at the North, it was a different society. First of all, it was much more hierarchical. In the north of France, actually, it was the hub of feudalism proper, and social stratification was enormous. An enormous amount of wealth was owned by an incredibly few amount of people, and this gave, naturally birth to the same French kingdom in its most hierarchical and majestic and actually even winning form. Right, northern France, the Langue d'Oil is Frankish feudalism as such. The south of France was more similar to Italy. That is, it was more seigneurial than Italy, but still kind of the wealth was more equally distributed. This brought the French court and its entourage and the rest of the nobles to fundamentally imitate the sacral models of the Capetian monarchy. Generally speaking, of the Frankish monarchy, it had been since Clovis. Actually, we made a pretty hefty video on the sacralization of the Merovingian monarchy, but this continued on, right? So there was this actually very different and very moralistic and stern facade of the northern French dynasts, right? One of the greatest example is, in fact, the jarring contrast in lifestyle and in characters between Louis VII of France and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, that, as you know, eventually would divorce and marry Henry II of England, changing with her dowry actually an enormous deal in European history. But I mean, it was a couple of extremes. Actually, Henry wore the cilitum, and she was instead one of the most passionate, kind of erotic, sensually, even open, but clearly, even if you look at what she actually composed, women on this time. But it was also a way of doing that. I don't know how much we can actually stress about the real private conduct of these people, but they came from different backgrounds that had two different models in that sense of power. This was royalty, and naturally, when you're royalty, you can't do as you want. You have an enormous burden, an enormous responsibility, and in every gesture and every action must be measured to your political goals in this regard. So France would go on with this highly kind of erratic and sacral mindset. Think about Louis IX, even a French king was a saint, and also besides one of the greatest kings of Europe at that time, but also think about Philip IV of France, and this idea that it's as if France at the end of the 13th century had even to take away the spiritual power from Rome and the imperial power from Germany. I mean, this was an enormous deal, right? It could have not been possible in other places. But Paris would become, aside from relatively the capital of the French kingdom, but also the Western Frankish kingdom, I'd say better at this point, also the main theological center of Europe. Like the University of Paris, of course, was the most important center of theological teaching, right? Whereas in other places they taught more law. Think about Bologna, for example. But Paris was, in this sense, a model in a point of reference, right? For the Roman Church. I mean, there was all, for example, an ether of positions. The Archbishopric of Rheims, for example, and then starting in Paris, etc., then becoming Archbishop either of Milan or Ravenna, and then to become Pope, right? It was a deep connection of this sort of cursus honorum that had to pass through a certified even theological education, and you understand why it was so upsetting for the church. And the same French and other monarchies that Aristotle would be taught even at the greatest theological center in Christianity, without having been accepted as a licit teaching, or having at least without having it introduced, rendered compatible with the Christian teaching proper. So the culture, from one side in France, we have the culture of the courts and the culture of the schools, as you understand that here are developing as well. There are many other important centers. The south of France, of course, had also its own, juridical studies, but naturally the theological ones maintained their preeminence. And from this broader Western Frankish area, there was a stimulation pouring throughout all of Europe, right? This is at the end of this period, the end of the 13th century, basically the French domination extends from the channel to Greece fundamentally, and it dominates everything. Right, the 13th century is the apex of power, of the French power, of the French monarchy that has finally seized the south. This huge chunk, this huge European region loaded in wealth, in culture, as we've seen, an opening on the Mediterranean. They managed to overthrow the Hohenstaufen from the Kingdom of Sicily, and they seized it. They had made the Byzantine Empire collapse fundamentally. They took Constantinople and they ruled in Greece. We made a video just recently about it. And the Anjou eventually, that are just a branch of the Capetian monarchy, they seize. They rise on the throne of Hungary and on the one of Poland. There is an enlargement, an incredible, in the process, of course, expansion of the French literary models, right? Even in, as we were saying before, Italy, that was more literate than France, but when they write usually in Provençal when they have to write in vernacular. Right, Dante was about to write the Divine Comedy in Southern French, actually, and fortunately did not so. But the great lords of northern Italy, for example, they read French stuff, French literature, of all the courtly romances and the Breton cycle and all, the paladins, because that's the model, right? That's the model in everything, in politics, in military technology, especially the equestrian warfare, right, of cavalry warfare, the greatest techniques and enhancements come from France, right? So all this naturally corresponds also to a political view, right, which is the one of feudalism, that is not hegemonic, however, everywhere, and finds its own limits as well, right? And naturally, French culture, in the process of its expansion, goes touching, and kind of fusing with other local traditions, creating on a local base a different, right, an original synthesis, and stimulating the local minds that even produced to this slow, gradual process, even of definition of our current national individualities. There are, for example, the first stanzas that we have in Italian vernacular came from Rimbaud of Vaqueras, that was a Provençal troubadour, right, that was tied at the time in the last decades of the 12th century to the Marquis Boniface of Montferrat in northwestern Italy. And you would say, this is a huge deal, even if you consider the characters themselves. Boniface of Montferrat actually, when at the Crusade, was one political pawn of Frederick Barbarossa. You can say that actually a huge deal of European and Mediterranean policy all gravitated around the loyalty of Montferrat to either the empire or the papacy at that time, which were struggling against each other. So troubadour like Rimbaud of Vaqueras becomes here at the court of Montferrat a you know a literary model that is at the center naturally, together with the court of Montferrat, of all this broader international reality, because these people actually knew each other, right, pretty well. I mean, they knew who was at the court of whom, who wrote what, and this content, this literally models, by the way, were all very political. It was all very bitter, sometimes satire, and think about Reinhard Fuchs in Germany. That comes from the Roman de Renard tradition, but that was, for example, bitterly criticizing exactly in these years Frederick the First Barbarossa policy in Italy, because they said, what the hell you owe there for? You want to create all these empires? It's very bitter. But it was eventually inspired to a French model, and it was an Alsatian source. Alsace being, of course, there were many French, influences in that, but it was German in that text, right? And talking about Regensburg, southern Germany, that is the most advanced, the most, interconnected, closer to the Mediterranean, more also with the Danubian route, also closer to the east some way, reaching, think about, yesterday we were talking about the First Crusade, importance of the Danubian route for reaching Constantinople, and even a trade of salt from Salzburg, etc. Regensburg, quite important city in Bavaria, of Roman foundation, bringing to this intense commerce all over southern Germany. Well, this is the court of the Welfen that import, right? The Welfen here, who are they? They're actually the main opponents and actually relatives of the Hohenstaufen, Frederick Barbarossa. What do? They're allied with the papacy, who is allied with France. They import chivalric epics and poetry from France into Germany. And what happens in there is that, of course, they were kind of French-like minded, because being French-minded, French-styled, French-fashioned in literature and in models was an implicit political stand in saying that the empire still now, at least the one ruled by the Hohenstaufen, because of course the Welfen would have been, happy to be emperors in their own turn, had to be weakened, and this naturally happened in favor of France, to which the Welfen were tied. But what happens in the process is that a German national lyric is born through this, randomly, but so it is, right? Think about the Minnesänger, that, they basically bring in these chivalric models from France, but they still load their stories essentially with these heroes of even the pagan past, right, of the Germanic epos, and they really structure it in a way it remained central in European art and culture and literature, right, and that spread further in the world. All this is born, right, and there are naturally many other channels through which these ideas pour overall, right? For example, the cities are very important. The religious ideal of the Italian Pateria, for example, and of the itinerant preachers in France, and the bold conception of the French theologians are fundamentally gravitating or actually happening within urban centers, right? Urban centers are the great, echo chambers of these ideas that where they spread from. The cities are, or in Europe now, are being all interconnected. There is an intense continental trade at this point that passes through the cities that are the great areas of, distribution of traffics, etc. So you can imagine in this regard from this simple examples, all the enormous the enormous amount of circulation and forms of thought of men during medieval times, right? This cultural movement constitutes the fabric of a common net, right? In which take shape certain peculiar characters, also of the single cultures in Europe. This is the moment in which, in fact, as we were saying before, we start talking about even national monarchies, realizing that there are somewhat national literatures, right? The term national is naturally object to, debate. This is not national in the same sense we mean it since the 19th century, right? But there is still a kind of proto-national, I don't know how you want to call it, character that definitely was there and was taking a shape, was speaking now essentially a language that at least could be understood, because you see, differently from the elites wrote in Latin, and there was no need to write in vernacular. But if you write in vernacular, the point is that you are going to be read by someone, right? That there is still an elitary, of course, or just a few people overall can read, but vernacular can be spoken. So there was a lot of oral tradition in this sense. Many people could write and read. In the process, of course, there were lots of most of these compositions were also meant to be sung, right? And very often they were actually sung by heart. But there is the idea that by writing it down, you can teach it to someone else, not just, doing it by voice, but just spreading this text further. And therefore, this corresponds, if this happened in vernacular, it's because there were people who could read that, and this is not just the fact that people could read more than in previous times at this point, but it's also the fact that they could read in those specific vernaculars that evidently are not so different from each other now in certain regions than they were before. And this builds up a specific literature. Like this is pretty obvious. Some of the greatest writers of that time that are imbued in this in this French influenced world. As before we were mentioning Dante, that is legitimately the greatest poet of the world medieval civilization. Dante was in Paris, for example. He was in France. He was thought he was educated. He wrote definitely at the beginning of the 14th century, but his anachronism, he was definitely attached to the universalistic models of the 13th that were stemming from definitely this French and Aristotelian, also from scholastic dominated vision, even if there was even in here and there some erratic relic, even or heterodox kind of, say better, relic in certain visions of the world, which also means that there was an originality in this regard. Well, Dante wrote in Florentine, as he was from Florence, and from the Divine Comedy stems modern Italian proper, right? Modern Italians speak essentially the language that Dante wrote his work in, and together with other followers of his, and of course in as a broader cultural legacy like Petrarch or Boccaccio, for example. But that's the same Florentine language. The Minnesänger in Bavaria. Well, modern German is largely Bavarian as such, right? And this originates in this greater southern wealth in art and literature that the Germany had at that very point, right? So this is very important, because even with French at this point, I mean, the Langue d'Oil, the Western Frankish kingdom conquers. Actually, at this point, it has become France, because exactly with Philip II, there is a transition from Western Frankish kingdom to Kingdom of France proper, officially. And what does France do? France is just what today is Northern France, right? And it incorporates Southern France, Occitane, right? And over time, the French monarchy rules over the south, and overall, the Langue d'Oil influences heavily the Languedoc that would have been much closer to Spanish and Italian compared to the langue d'oil. And if today we study French, we study the langue d'oil. We study the language of the north, right? Like Castilian for Spanish. And there are countless examples in this regard. It starts here. So that's why this is really a pivotal moment in European history. So there are definitely a lot of fruitful and vivacious encounters, even among Europeans at this point. Being bilingual among literates was normal at this time. It was normal to tour Europe, learning, studying, and this culture is ever more within the veins, the vessels of universalism, that naturally was helped, of course, by Latin, because that was the main, it was the English of the time, but even more, right? It was more like that than that, because it was the language of the church. That was the language of universalism as such. Nobody spoke Greek at the time. At least a very few literates did, and Latin was the language of the Bible, of course. So the meaning behind, naturally, even the Romance, the Latin legacy proper in Western Europe was enormous. As a matter of fact, it was even a distinctive way of, at this point, the great schism, even with Constantinople, had already happened. So the kind of the Hellenic dominated world was, being overrun, as we were saying before, by the same French. Thinking about the Latin Empire, it was essentially a set of French power fiefdoms in Greece. So this is even a lacerating, disruptive moment, right? Of course, what starts happening here has an impact on the realities that, if you think about it, hadn't remained dramatically unchanged, especially in Western Europe, since the migration era, right? The idea of a common, before we were talking about the import of French feudalism into Germany under Frederick Barbarossa. Well, before that, feudalism in Germany actually develops quite intensively. By the end of the 13th century, Germany is deeply feudalized, and within it there is even a further, for example, fragmentation of the original of the unity of the original so-called ethnic duchies that were roughly corresponding to some of the more ancient repartitions in terms of settled peoples since the migration era, that naturally had a very few to do with this now in the first place after 700 years, but they get kind of blurred and blended and pulverized into the fragmentation of political fragmentation of Germany after the extinction of the Hohenstaufen, and with a common language that is fundamentally feudal in nature, and in this sense also French influenced. There are countless beautiful examples of all of this and there was what is fascinating of this, there was an actual recognition that it was happening. It was a clear awareness of this, right? It wasn't a negative process that was denied or preconceived. Think about, I always bring on, I don't know why now, but my master thesis, everything that happened when I wrote it. There is, once again, this beautiful source that is actually from the very opposite side of France, because it was from Steiermark in southeastern Germany, today's Austria actually, and this was written by a son of knights, of ministeriales actually, actually at the beginning of the 14th century. We were at the time of Frederick III of Habsburg, and okay, with this digression I would have to explain lots of things about late political, let's say late 13th, beginning of early 14th century Germany, but let's try to skip this because that would be very fascinating. It would make you understand also how much French culture, influenced these realities. Like, fundamentally, Rudolf of Habsburg, that had founded, the Austrian dominions of his house, or better, had seized Austria, had received from Philip IV of France the acceptation of his role as king of the Romans at the time when he seized Austria, and Rudolf was the greatest prince he was the monarch, he was German king and king of the Romans, but he was de facto now a private prince of the empire as well, and the most powerful, and in comparison, even with his Swabian and Austrian domains, I mean, France was a colossus at this point. I mean, Rudolf had lived to, he was born when Frederick II still reigned. Of course, at the beginning of the 13th century, there had already been a kind of dissolution of the centralized system of the Hohenstadt. Frederick II let the German prince just kind of doing whatever they wanted in exchange of actually, his own privileges in some way as a private German prince. He wanted to seize Austria himself of the Hohenstaufen back in the day after the Babenberg had extinguished, and even if he felt a lot his role of king of Germany, of Holy Roman Emperor, he still gave up Germany for Italy. And the point though is that, I don't know why I'm talking about this, but the fact is that the Habsburgic world within that source, the Steirische Reimkönig, had emerged, is that also Frederick of Habsburg, that was the patron of this author, was actually, let's say, against, pro-France in anti-Wittelsbach function at the time of Ludwig the Bavarian, that had descended in Italy, still, allied with the Ghibellines in an anti-French, anti-Angevin, and anti-Papal in that regard policy orientation, and that author of the Styrian Rime Chronicle wrote quite clearly in this great battle that he was depicting essentially German knights fighting actually from both sides, that they were fighting so well. At some point he writes that, as if they had been taught by those of France themselves, right? Think of what it means for a German that by the beginning of the 14th century, German cavalry had actually reached some levels that were actually comparable to the French ones. The French were superior, but at least in collective training, etc., as always, by the way. But the Germans were considered more impetuous, and this kind of mix of chivalry and still also kind of warlike mentality of ancestral, tied in fact to the Germanic epics, etc., made consider actually many people elsewhere, the Germans, as also actually the best knights out there. Still, this author piously writes that, those German knights were fighting so well as if they had been taught by the French ones. And you understand there that it's a... Is it a cliche? Is it we can't say that. I mean, I don't know whether he actually believed the thing he wrote of it is a rhetorical expedient. But, and the interesting thing is that he even conceived the thing, that he even, it was normal to actually to state such a thing without any doubt. And it tells you also much about the stupidity of today's nationalism, in the sense that, if you look at the 13th century Germany, I think many nationalists, look at those times as a moment of deep purity and unaltered, national culture was yet to be formed as such, actually, was just starting now, saying, no, we are really from this country, we are the best, we're the only one. This cream of German literature is simply stating that, the French were the best knights ever, right? And reflect this, in a 19th century scenario in which, the Germans hated French gods like hell, and vice versa, by the way. just for saying, and there was an hostility too there, actually, right? Because this thing was recognized transnationally. I mean, it wasn't just because of, the guy was under the Habsburgs at that point. I think the Habsburgs didn't care so much about the French. They were just allies in a way, but let's not exaggerate. In terms of pride of their knighthood, and they were deep matters, right? And it would be interesting to dwell more on these kind of national stereotypes, because it's plenty of them actually in medieval times, and they all have a specific place in this regard. What can we say more? There is naturally also an external influence, right? There is first of all, a tradition. Never think that in this process medieval literature abandoned the reference to the authorities, to the classical past, to the fathers of the church. That was the main ground on which everything was based, right? And this is normal, of course. But there was also a great, and they were so safe about themselves in this regard. In a this is still attached to the nationalistic thing. You see, many people who need identity reasons think that there were at that time fixed cultures and there were opposites, right? When yesterday we were talking about the Crusades, and we often stress how the boundary between even just Christian and Islam was very blurry, and politically speaking, everybody did whatever the hell they liked. Well, Christian European culture was so confident with her fundamentals that didn't mind actually getting stuff from Africa, from Asia, from this principal Muslim world that actually produced pretty interesting stuff at that point. Think about courts like the one of Egypt. Think about, of course, the great Persian tradition. It was also dramatically similar to the chivalric one in Western Europe, and of course all the Hellenistic legacy, right? That Islam had actually even spread and elaborated further than what the Byzantines did actually during old medieval times. So much that Aristotle that was taught in Paris was not Aristotle, was actually Avicenna, right? So, and this naturally had an impact even on the Aristotle that was integrated in scholastic, right? So that came from a Muslim translation and a re-elaboration of the Aristotelian context, and eventually was integrated as the cosmological view of the Catholic Orthodox Church, let's call it in this way. And was nothing bad about it, because guess what? If you live in a mindset in which there is a universalistic order, and what you take here has not color per se, has no absolute value identitarily speaking, but it's simply framed within the creation, you don't get this kind of nationalistic fanatism. That is not to say, of course, nationalism at this time could not happen, because they were not the basis for this. But these people, of course, hated each other guts, right? There were the Crusades going on. Guess what? But as we were saying, this happened basically as a relation with any other single power that existed. Even when we were saying the same Europeans, and what really mattered in this chaos was the unity presented by universalism that was taking even a scientific and rational method as Aristotle and scholastics actually proven this point. And also there is always the pattern of the institutional frames in which naturally this culture was disciplined. That regulated human coexistence, exercise of power. So certain dynamics that were somewhat exclusive, of course, and even repressive, as you can imagine. Look at the Albigensian Crusade and other. There is a final note that I would like to make on women and the female role in all of this, because we didn't make many gender video, themed videos. I think I made only one video about working women in the Middle Ages, and this is actually just being a small reflection about it. So let's say that between the 11th and the 12th century, as we have seen in that video on Bernard of Clairvaux and architectural aesthetics, there is also a transformation of female, let's call them models as such. There is, as we were saying before, an ever more lively devotion for Virgin Mary. The Occitanic courtly word produces the ideal of the domina, right, as the domina, and of course this noble woman that, loaded with, idealized and angelic-like forms and thoughts. So also there is a preponderance of the female element in a monastic structure, like in the one proposed by Robert d'Arbrissel. Even the engagement of women in some of the spontaneous religious movements, for example. Women worked sometimes in some of the riskiest and most difficult and tiring enterprises, being paid less than men. They worked even in construction centers, etc., for not talking regularly on the overwhelming agricultural world, as the majority of the population lived. There are definitely, and especially towards the late Middle Ages, if you look at certain Flemish guilds, there were even certain women. I don't remember if at the head of the corporation, but at least some among the main members. But yeah, of course, it wasn't such an enormous participation. We can't really say whether this period was so. You see, there is a pattern interpretation that people think that, I don't know, the Christian world was oppressive/repressive towards everything and everyone, especially women. Of course, the world of the time wasn't very gentle towards anyone, and surely women suffered of an actual, I would call it discrimination in the neutral sense of the world, based even on things that were developed even by scholastics. For example, Aristotle had quite very flattering comments about women, right? He thought they were fundamentally more stupid because having on average smaller shoulders, less blood arrived to their head. Like, that was the foundation of the science of the time. These things were believed, right, and shared and remained up to the modern age, and as a regular belief, actually pseudo-scientifically certified matter of fact, right? And there would be many interesting digressions to open even about certain professions that women carried out, as obstetricians, for example, that didn't exist as such. And women at the time actually knew much more about a delivery, childbirth, than actually doctors did at the time. And this was true actually for up to a very few time ago, because medicine at the time was completely, and I stress here the word completely, theoretical, right? They didn't touch bodies, they didn't touch corpses, they didn't dissect. I mean, at least they did so, because we know that eventually this thing went on. I mean, look at Leonardo later on. I mean, they of course dissected bodies, but actually that was wrong because of the belief in resurrection and the bodies and everything. It was condemned by the Christianity. Naturally, all the as we were saying before, they couldn't discipline society as a whole, so these things happen anyway. But the idea that I formed throughout this time is actually that Christianity, first of all, didn't bring to more repression to women as such. There is this narrative that is widespread, especially among people who are kind of tribalistic mindset and generally stress tribal societies and paganism as allegedly, a superior form of civilization over Christianity, all this nonsense, for which saying, Christian women were so much more, repressed and even stating as if, for example, the Viking, Scandinavian world during the Viking era was a place where women were free. They could do everything. They could easily divorce and do whatever the hell they liked. The fact that those were less regulated societies has literally nothing to do with the degree of freedom that actual individuals enjoyed, especially women. Women who came out of their roles, of course, they could divorce, but in which situations and with which kind of social consent and familial consent, that's a wholly another thing. Like, if you know anything about Germanic laws, you realize how actually unfree women were compared to the Christian ones at this time. So the fact that a society is more regulated, it's actually a consequence of the fact that society is more advanced, it's more developed, it's more articulated, and it's possible, as we will see now, that women were actually more framed, like there was an increased regulation. We know it easily. Even in successory law, women started inheriting less, right? In this time, though, right, in places even that were Christian since centuries and centuries, not just Northern Europe. There's not just Northern Europe as a model of interpretation, but because societies were becoming richer, as a consequence, there was a stricter regulation of assets control. This is pretty clear. For example, in communal Italy, in places where even the Longobards law that had pre-existed there was fairly, had grown at least to be fairly, flexible compared to the original Germanic base. Even for certain transactions, women participate. We see it from the juridical practices of the later centuries. But the fact that a society is more regulated doesn't mean that these women actually lived worse than before. This is the problem, right? Many people say, oh, well, you see, but towards the end of the Middle Ages, at least, there was the Ancien Regime, and society crystallized, so everything got kind of worse. Even the peasantry was better off before, then it got worse, so women were kind of subordinated, so it was also for them. I don't know actually if a person in the 12th century lived so much better than a person in the 17th, right? I personally don't believe it, as I don't believe necessarily a person in the 7th century lived better than one in the 12th. I think we have a problem in in perspective of the actual living conditions of people. And as far as I'm concerned, civilization improved. So this doesn't, proportionally and immediately transfer itself into saying, okay, people necessarily lived better, right? It's obvious that maybe, I don't know, in the Soviet Union, people lived better than in the 12th century, but I mean, that life still sucked for 20th century standards. So yes, it depends. And this has largely to do also with the history of thought. And generally speaking, we don't know very much, and we don't know about much about female thinking in the 12th century. We just realized that society as a whole began to symbolize the woman in a much more positive and human and sweet, I would say, way, as much even in a sensual one, because actually it's plenty of literature this time starts being openly erotic, openly sexual, right? And even in actual, pretty graphically so. These types of texts were actually very, very widespread. Even Dante wrote some of this. So you see, another characteristic that appears in this time is that literates are capable of writing every single type of genre. This wouldn't happen in the later Middle Ages. In the later Middle Ages, with humanism, there is a contraction. There is an increasing hypocrisy in this regard. So it is true that probably the situation is not so clear. So we can't really understand how much the 12th century actually promoted the condition of the woman, right? And this evaluation is to remain controversial and very difficult to assert. Anyhow, between the 12th and the 13th century, the clerical culture and let's say to the clerical culture and the ecclesiastical structures was imposed what we call like a female question, right? That was how to discipline the religious experiences that were multiplicating themselves, and in this autonomous way, right? And by women that were in this sense nor part of the clergy, but also not lay in a strict sense, and how also to protect how to deal with those women who, for example, participated to the heterodox movements as well, right? This was a question that was posed at the time, together with all the ones, towards the pauperistic-evangelical movements. There had been a lot of troubles, actually, even for the fact that, women couldn't preach. Women couldn't officiate the sacraments. This had been a great deal of problem. There had been many excommunications. Some of look at the Valdensians, for example. That was among the poors of Lyon. There was a female presence that was given even this kind of. It became kind of the stone of discord in even the relation with the papacy, etc. So this is important because it highlights that at least the role of women was more considerate than before, and that they actually had a greater importance, at least in these communities, and the presence of them actually evidently was accepted in later times, together with the mendicant orders, etc. So this was eventually accepted even by the Roman Church as a regulated thing. It was fine. Also, what did it mean to be a woman at this point, right? Within the family, outside, there were important deals, and obviously the elites, the authorities, were fundamentally a male society. And the impression is that there was a rationalization of the condition of female subalternity, female subordination, in a way, right? In the general domination of the life of entire populations, we seem to observe, at least for this time, and probably also for the ones to come, that together naturally with this regulation that started happening at every level of society, there was the one definitely also of the role of the woman within that society. So that doesn't make an exception, and why would it, right? This was happening with basically every aspect of society, every individual, and things were definitely taking a ever less, as you know, these greater movements of protests were fundamentally crushed. But the ones that knew how to negotiate found their place, found their role, and were regularized as such, and they are part even of our times ecclesiastical reality, where definitely women have an important part, and it is I always interpret this phase of history, as you understand from the videos I made on the pauperistic evangelic movements, as after all, as a success of civilization as well, right? I can't read it otherwise. The more I learn about it, the more I think that there is few to say that about the fact, this different views of how to live the spirituality were crushed. As modern secular people, we can think it was wrong, but if you contextualize it in the words of this time, it's not that these movements were actually wanting something specifically, more liberal than that. Some of these messages were actually much more radical and fundamentalistic, even than the more flexible of the church. I mean, what do you want more from the church than even integrating and incorporating and regularizing the same pauperistic evangelic movements? That is a civilization. A non-civilization would have simply exterminated all these people, and would have crashed in the process because it could have been unsustainable, right? This thing went on to transform itself into something better, right? And you can argue that individual freedom kind of came less. Did it? In absolute terms, in relative terms, probably yes. And the path of civilization went on. We grew from that. I know I sound repetitive in a way. I think it's it could be expressed also in different terms, and maybe I will make a video to explain it better at some point. But the concept here is that there were not setbacks, right? It's difficult to have this understood for people that were grown, for example, in the idea that intrinsically things like Christianity or any theism or any even any other strengthening of authority or structuration of power and control of populations was something inherently negative. But if you look at what we have now, the strength of our states and the rights they can provide and the ideas that permeated the vows, you can't avoid to see the seeds in here, right? And it's not to be apologetic. We all know what kind of world this was, and of course this went on with abuses and violences and oppression. No doubt, it still happens, but still it's better than before. And I know I realize that arriving at this point, I know that there are people out there who will never change their mind about. So it will come always to the point, okay, it should always be the society of free people, and it's like talking a bit of like with this more, this I don't know how to call them, but with the same pauperistic-evangelical movements at the time, right? In part being right, in part being wrong, and we're all doing the same thing here. Right, we're still having that dialectic that exists today as much as it existed at the time, but through which eventually we improved. So even if these people lost, apparently, I think in part they won. Definitely the Franciscans won. Maybe people say, okay, well, but eventually they were transformed into a copy of the Dominicans, and the most extreme fringes, idealistic fringes were suppressed. Yes, okay, yes, because what's the most idealistic fringes saying? Let's abandon property in toto, right? Completely. Let's leave all like poor. Really, right? For doing what actually? How do you help your next in this sense? So that's, I think, the limit of the of the positivity of saying, okay, let's just be more concerned about certain things that go beyond just mere materialism. Yeah, okay, it's perfectly fine. I think we all are. Now we're digressing. Today I just really wanted to present this perspective in general, and not to sound like a like someone just like promoter or propaganda maker or something like that. Anyhow, let's stop it here for now. We'll talk about these topics hopefully a lot in the future again. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.